We didn't know till today that there's evidence from years ago that there's something there. Europa is one of the most fascinating bodies in the solar system. We think beneath its icy surface is a global ocean, twice the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. In the late 1990s, the Galileo spacecraft explored the Jupiter system. It made about a dozen flybys of Europa. It took observations from its cameras and from its magnetometer.
By discovering that there was an induced magnetic field at Europa, we were led to the conclusion that there must be an ocean just beneath the icy surface of the moon. But there were some strange signatures in the magnetic field that we had never really been able to account for.
Images of Europa from the Hubble Space Telescope have hinted at gases that might have come from plumes erupting at Europa.
The Hubble images had given an estimate of the height and width, and I knew how fast Galileo was moving relative to Europa.
There are better tools now, better computational techniques, better computing, that we can go back and look at that old data set anew.
So my colleague Shinja Jia set up a calculation to see what would happen in the environment of Europa if there were such a plume. And when he ran this simulation, it agreed just beautifully with the data that we had collected.
Reanalysis of the Galileo magnetometer data suggests that the Galileo spacecraft, on its closest flyby of Europa, flew through a plume. The Europa Clipper mission is going to explore Europa to investigate its habitability. If we find active plumes, then we can sail on through them and sniff and taste that stuff that's in the plume. We can analyze the particles and the gases to get at the detailed composition of Europa's interior.
Good afternoon. I'm Lori Glaze, the Acting Director of the Planetary Science Division at NASA, and I'm really excited to be here today talking with planetary scientists about this recent result confirming plumes on Europa. I'm joined today by my co-pilot, Joanna Wendell. Joanna is a communications specialist here at NASA, and to my left is Dr. Elizabeth Turtle from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. Zibby is interested in the moons of the planets in the outer part of our solar system. To Zibby's left, we don't have her yet, but we have Dr. Shinja Jia, who led the research that we just saw about in that video. And Shinja is from the University of Michigan, and he's interested in magnetic and plasma environments on the planets and their moons. And I'm hoping we'll also be joined by Dr. Margaret Kivelson from the University of California, Los Angeles, and she was a scientist on the Galileo mission, and she led the magnetometer investigation that discovered the ocean on Europa. So with that, I think I'd like to toss it over to Joanna, and would you like to kick off this discussion?
Yes, I would. This is a super exciting new line of evidence for Europa plumes, which is awesome. But I think before we really get into the nitty-gritty of these findings, we should really back up a little bit and figure out what is Europa and where is it?
Europa is one of the large moons of Jupiter, the planet Jupiter. It's somewhat smaller than our moon, and out at Jupiter's distance from the sun, Europa's surface is covered in ice, in water ice.
Yeah.
But beneath that water ice layer, there's evidence that there's a liquid water ocean.
Wow.
Which is really exciting.
That is so exciting. And it's so far away from the sun, so we know it's covered in ice, but how does an ocean survive out there? A liquid ocean survive way out there?
Well, there's an interaction between the different moons of Jupiter.
Yeah.
Io, which is the closest moon to Jupiter, Europa, and then Ganymede. And they're in what's called a resonance,
Yeah.
which means kind of like when you're pushing someone on a swing,
Yeah.
every time they come back, you give them a little more
Yeah.
push, and the moons do the same
Cool.
thing to each other in their orbits, and that actually generates a lot of energy.
Wow.
So Io has silicate volcanoes, just like Kilauea that's
Yeah.
erupting right now.
Yeah.
Right.
And as you move further out, the moons get progressively colder.
Okay.
So Europa still has an icy surface, but a liquid water ocean underneath. A
Okay.
fairly thin ice shell, and as you get out to Ganymede, there's a thicker ice shell,
Okay.
but also with a liquid water ocean
But the heat keeps the water liquid beneath the icy
Exactly.
crust.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How
So then what is a plume?
So one of the questions that we've had about Europa with this fairly shallow ocean
Yeah.
is whether or not there's current activity at the surface. And one way that kind of activity can manifest itself is by what we call cryovolcanism, which is
Oh.
cold volcanism.
Whoa.
And we see that at Saturn's moon,
Yeah.
Enceladus,
Okay.
where there are large plumes
Right.
of
Right.
liquid water and ice particles that are jetting out of the south pole of Enceladus.
Yeah.
But it's been a long-standing question
Yeah.
as to whether we have that kind of activity at Europa as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, that's so. Like, how do you even go about trying to find plumes? I mean, what are the different techniques we've used to even find these things? And either of you can.
I don't know, maybe
speak to that.
Shinjab could
Yeah.
talk a little bit about,
Yeah, I mean, of course, from telescopes, you could observe existence of potential plumes. So that was actually being done back a few years ago when Hubble first sent back images in 2012, and the scientists have found, hints that those images might contain signatures of potential plumes at Europa. A couple of years later, they obtained further images and actually saw plumes occurring potentially at other locations from the first detection. So telescopic observation certainly is a very useful, valuable tool to search for plumes.
I just wanted to interrupt for a second. When you say that Hubble sent back images, I mean, are we talking about, point and shoot image, and we see the vapor, sort of cloudy? I mean, when you say image, what are we actually seeing with our eyes in this image?
Yeah, so there are two kinds of, I think, techniques are being used so far from Hubble. The first set of images taken by Hubble, we're looking at the emissions of molecules being struck by electrons that would generate emissions, and those emissions at a specific wavelength will be captured by Hubble. And the follow-up,
Kind of like the aurora in our atmosphere, is that a similar process?
Yeah, similar process. And the follow-up observation from Hubble, I believe, was looking at actual absorption of atmosphere water molecules of the lights. So the two different kinds of techniques are so far being used to look for plumes.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. So but how did we discover them this time? So this was, what I understand is that we knew that there were plumes, or we believed there were plumes from the Hubble observations. But you and your team went back and looked at the older data from the prior mission, from Galileo. Can you tell us a little bit about the Galileo mission, or maybe Margaret can tell us a little bit about the Galileo mission and the instrument that she led there?
Yeah, let's get Margaret.
Can we get Margaret
Hello?
on here.
Hi. Can you tell us a little bit about the Galileo mission and the magnetometer instrument and investigation?
I love to talk about the Galileo mission and the magnetometer instrument. So the Galileo mission reached Jupiter in 1995 and was there for 8 years in orbit for spacecraft in orbit around Jupiter. And one of the key parts of the mission was to make close flybys of the 4 large moons of Jupiter. And there were 11 flybys of Europa. And in a flyby, the time close to the moon is of particular interest because that changes the way in which the charged particle gases in the vicinity of the moon move, it slows them down, it diverts the flows and changes the magnetic field. And so for each pass, we looked at changes in the magnetic field that were associated with approaching the moon. And on one particular pass by Europa, the spacecraft came very, very close to the surface, as I remember, less than 150 kilometers above the surface. And it was on that pass that we saw signatures that we never really understood. So I don't know if you want me to go on at this point. Or
Well,
Yeah, that was great.
so my
That's very helpful.
question-
Thank you.
Yeah, so my question then would be, what inspired you to go back into this, 20-year-old data, right? You know, there was this signature that maybe you never understood, but what was the thing that made you go, oh, maybe we should check that out again? And, either Shinja or Margaret can address.
Well, you can start, Ginger.
Okay. And I think really we're largely inspired by those Hubble detections published back a few years ago. As I remember, almost exactly a year ago, we had a Europa Clipper Project Science Group meeting in Columbia, Maryland. The 5th meeting we had, so all the team scientists were gathering together and talking about science related to Europa. And one of our colleagues, Melissa McGrath, so she was showing a summary of all the available Hubble images we had so far of Europa potential plume detection. And the latest paper was just published about a month before this meeting. So she was talking about, the locations of potential plumes in those images. And that is the moment that really, I think, led us to realize that we had to go back to look at Galileo data, because one of the flybys, as Margaret just mentioned, had a closest approach altitude that's just a couple hundred kilometers above the surface in a region that is very close to the repeat plume detection by Hubble.
That's
amazing.
I
Yeah.
mean, what are the chances, right? So what I want to do is sort of paint a word picture here. Flying through a plume. I mean, what is this plume? What do we think it looks like? I mean, are we talking about like a paper airplane flying over Old Faithful Geyser in Yellowstone? I mean, what do we think is going on there?
Well, it would be very tenuous. You'd be able to sense it. Clearly, Galileo sensed it,
Yeah.
but Galileo didn't see it.
Okay.
So optically, it's not necessarily very optically thick.
Okay.
Is how we'd refer to it. There are not a lot of particles, which is good, since
hard to-
Galileo
Yeah,
flew
yes.
through,
it
flew
didn't
through
get
it.
Right.
shot, out of orbit.
But we do have some example from the Cassini spacecraft that did observations of Enceladus and its plume. And in terms of the imaging observations, if you look at the plume, if you look at Enceladus and hopefully Europa,
Yep.
when the sun is on the other side, so you're kind of looking through the plume
Yeah.
at the sun,
Yeah.
the scattering
Yeah,
by particles in the plume
Okay.
make them stand out very well. And we
Okay.
have beautiful observations of the plumes of Enceladus, and
Yeah.
that's something that we hope to do in the future
Yeah.
with Europa as well.
And
So cool.
slightly silly question: could it have seen a rainbow? Like in the mist, like is there like enough mist here that maybe it could any kind of plume fly by could see a rainbow? I've always wondered that.
I don't know that there's enough signal at the different wavelengths
wavelengths.
to be able
Okay.
to pull that out, but
Got
we
it,
will.
yeah.
With Europa Clipper, look at
you
plumes
go.
with a variety of wavelengths.
Awesome.
So
Perfect.
stay tuned.
Maybe our first interplanetary rainbow
Yeah.
coming up.
And presumably you'll do the same sort of experiment where you can put the sun behind the plume and see it, and perhaps see if it's possible to optically see it. If
Exactly,
it's thick enough.
exactly.
Okay.
That's one of the things that
Okay.
we've worked into the plans,
To the design.
with both the cameras on Europa Clipper and the ultraviolet spectrograph, which will be much more sensitive. But there are a number of other ways that we can look for current or recent activity. In terms of, I mean, you can look directly for it. You can also look for thermal signatures or
what does that mean?
particulates. So you can look to see if there's heat
Okay.
coming from the surface. And
Yeah.
in fact, there is some evidence that there may be heat in near the same region that the plume was seen, correct?
Yeah, so the plume we identified in this particular study falls within the general region that we call thermal anomaly that has been observed back again in the Galileo era, published by scientists in the 1990s. And so it appears to be that general region seems to have elevated temperature compared to the surroundings.
Okay.
And why is that interesting? If there's a region of heat, we're talking, of course, about ice, so it's not hot, but hotter.
But it's hot. It's hot for
It's
ice.
hot for
yes.
ice.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
what is the significance of that thermal anomaly? So this region of elevated temperatures.
So that would tell us that it would give us information about how much activity there is, how much heating is going into Europa, how it's being focused. It also helps us understand the nature of the ice shell itself.
Okay.
And one of the things we're particularly interested in is exchange processes where we may get material like a plume, where material is coming from the ocean through the ice shell to the out above Europa. And so it would be really important to understand the temperatures of the material that's coming up, of the ice shell beneath it.
Okay, gotcha.
Very cool. I wanted to thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much. And we also, it looks like we have a question from the media here, a question from Will Dunham from Thomson Reuters. And the question is, to what degree do these findings suggest that Europa possesses the conditions to harbor microbial or other life forms? And do these findings change your views about Europa as a leading candidate for hosting life? I'm going to direct that one to Zibby again, I think. I don't know.
Well, we know that Europa has a lot of the ingredients necessary for life. Certainly for life as we know it. There's liquid water, there's energy, there's some amount of carbon material. But the habitability of Europa is one of the big questions that we want to understand. And one of the really exciting things about detection of a plume is that means there may be ways that the material from the ocean, which is likely the most habitable part of Europa because it's warmer and it's protected from the radiation environment by the ice shell. So there may be ways for material from that ocean to come out above the ice shell, and that means we'd be able to sample it. So that's one of the reasons this is so exciting.
Just to sort of back up about the Galileo data, was Galileo able to tell what was in the plume?
I think the data we have, the two data sets we analyzed in this study, magnetic field and the plasma wave data, they do not directly tell us the makeup of the plume, the composition of the plume. What we inferred was, it's likely, highly likely, given the composition of the near surface material on Europa, and we think it's, if it's a plume, it's largely composed of potentially of water.
Okay, great.
Cool. I think we have another question.
All right.
Another question from the media, from Chris Gebhardt at nasaspaceflight.com. And the question is, what kind of impact do you anticipate this having on the upcoming Europa Clipper mission, and will any instruments or mission aspects be tweaked? And I think this is kind of a general question for all of us. I know Zibby's very heavily involved in the Europa Clipper. She's actually leading the cameras on that mission. So I'm sure she has thoughts, but I'm kind of opening it up. I'd like to know if other people think that this could have an impact.
I don't think it will tweak the instruments at this point. The instruments were specifically selected to be able to search for and study exactly this kind of activity. So we have the right instruments already on board. Whether or not the trajectory can be tweaked so that the spacecraft flies closer to this area. We're obviously limited by the laws of physics, so can't get to every part of the surface close up. But that's an area that would be able to be tweaked.
So
as
will
well
the
as
orbits be able to get deep enough to get down and fly through the plumes again?
So the closest approach altitudes for Europa Clipper get down to 25 kilometers.
Wow.
So they're very close. Now, whether that 25 kilometers can be done.
Oh my God, that's like,
yeah, it is.
oh my God.
So whether we can get that close in the region where the plume material has been detected is limited, again, by the trajectory of the spacecraft. So I don't know if you've looked at how close Clipper gets to that area.
I think in general, as far as I know, as its current plan is, Clipper, as you just said, ZB, will conduct more than 40 flybys, close flybys of Europa, and over 40 of them will have flyby altitudes at close approach less than 400 kilometers high. And that certainly itself is good news because the plume we identified in this study, we saw the strong signal between the altitudinal range of 200 to 400 kilometers. So the closer you get to the surface, probably the chance you're seeing signatures of plume will be higher. So I think in that respect, Clipper certainly is in a very good position. And so I think maybe the project, we have to look more carefully at, which region is being covered by all these very low altitude flybys.
Right. Okay.
Interesting.
So it's less about the instruments changing and more about maybe where we send them or,
Right, and the observational strategy,
Right, and the
right?
observational
This gives us
strategy.
an initial place to start looking. I mean, obviously, the plan was to do as global a search as possible for plumes. But this gives us a place to target initially.
Yeah. Oh,
So what kinds of things are we actually looking for in those plumes? Where we're talking about the ability to fly through the plumes and identify that the plumes are there. But what types of measurements are we making other than just looking at them? But are we taking chemical measurements and trying to understand what type of chemistry is going on in those plumes? And do we have the ability to say, yes, there is microbial life, or yes, there's a potential for microbial life? So that's a question.
If only.
We do have instrumentation to be able to detect particles, to be able to make chemical measurements. There's a mass spectrometer that would be able to tell what the chemical components of the plume or the atmosphere of Europa. Europa has a very tenuous atmosphere, but nonetheless there's material there, and so we'd be able to look at that.
Right.
And we'd be able to detect dust particles. We'll get information about composition. But it's a long stretch to go from being able to measure the specific composition to being able to
I know, it's a big jump.
Yes.
That's a really, and I think it's important for us to all really understand just how hard that is to do, to actually say we've detected something that's alive. That's a really big jump. Right, so we have to take the steps in order to get there, right? To get all the way to that.
Unless, we put a GoPro on it and see the flying space lizards, I don't know. If only.
If only. So we have another question here. This is from Twitter user Manish. He asks, why is Europa considered by many to be the most likely place in the solar system to find life?
Great question.
It's a good question. It is certainly one of the, a high probability location in the solar system. It's certainly not the only location that we've identified in the solar system that could potentially be a place where life is harbored. So just some thoughts there.
Well, we know there's liquid water, and that's, of course, for life as we know it, required. And so that's one of the reasons. And at Europa, the liquid water is fairly close to the surface. But as you say, there are a number of places in the outer solar system that may be habitable. Enceladus has a similar, liquid water ocean that is venting.
Which one's bigger? I always forget that.
Enceladus is much smaller.
Okay.
Is much smaller.
Right. So just to kind of review, so Enceladus and Titan are both moons of Saturn. So they're a little bit further out. But, do you think we're more likely to find life on Europa than at Enceladus or Titan, or is it fairly even, or is it just more challenging in some of the other environments?
It's hard to say. I mean, that's one of the reasons that habitability is such a key thing to study, because we really right now have only the one data point. And so what we want to do is gather more data points, and we have different environments at these places. Titan, for example, has a very rich carbon chemistry. And so it's kind of a carbon world as well as an ocean world. And so that's a different dimension in terms of the question of habitability.
So we have a great question from Facebook user Antonia, which is related to what we were just talking about, which is, are the plumes generated by the same physical causes as on Enceladus? So we were talking about, we know there's plumes on Enceladus. We now have plumes on Europa that are confirmed. So is it the same physical process that's causing these plumes?
And maybe we can start by talking about what are those processes. What do we think is causing the plumes, and is that maybe also happening on Europa?
Right. Okay. So Shinjo,
Yeah, I think
what do you
there have
think?
been suggestions, theories, models being put out trying to understand, for example, in Enceladus, why plumes exist at Enceladus. There were the suggestion has been, this tidal flexing.
Right, right.
When you have a ice cover floating above a liquid layer, and as the moon is orbiting around its parent planet, I mean, Enceladus is Saturn, and the Europa, we're talking about Jupiter. So it changes its distance relative to the parent planet. So this flexing is changing as well. So depending on the orbital phase, how close and how far the moon is away from the planet, you might see at some locations it's squeezing, trying to squeeze the moon and making this material coming out into space. And that has been, I think, fairly well established at the Enceladus when Cassini sent back a lot of data that allow scientists to see this correlation, the orbital phase.
At different places in the orbit, there's more of an eruption
more of
or less of an
activity
eruption.
than other places.
Exactly.
And that's the thing we still don't quite understand, I think, at the Europa, because of very sparse, very few data points we have so far.
Yeah. And when you say this, the flexing sort of squeezes the material out, do you mean like squeezing a toothpaste tube and the toothpaste comes out? It's kind of squeezing the,
I think it's more a case that when there's extension in that region, when the crust is stretched, it allows material to escape, and then when there's compression, when it's being pushed together, there's less material that escapes.
Yeah. Yep. Gotcha.
Right. We've got another great question here. We've got lots of good questions. Question from the media, Jesse Shanahan from Forbes Science. What is causing the unusual heating in this specific region? So this is another great question for Shinjo.
Yeah.
See that it's warmer there, but what do we think is happening?
Yeah.
I think the exact origin of my understanding of reading, the literature has been the exact origin of why this particular region seems to be warmer than other places is not really very well understood. There are, I think, different models, theories being put out trying to explain this thermal anomaly. Could be internal, but also could be tied to the surface material. The thermal properties are different due to other processes. So I don't think we really know exact origin of the anomaly at this particular.
Or how long-lived it is.
Yeah, how long
we don't know how long
Right.
it's been.
That's a good point.
That's a very good point.
Although the comparison, being able to compare the Galileo data to the upcoming Clipper data will give us a bit of a, not geologic timescales, but a few decades worth to compare and look for changes, and so that's going to be very interesting as well.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. We've got another great question here. Facebook user Sarah asks, to clarify, are these pop-up storms, so looking at the radar now won't be helpful in determining timing of the storms? So I guess of the eruptions, right? Of the
plumes,
of the plumes, right? Of the plumes.
Right.
I think that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So then, first to clarify, this isn't like a weather phenomenon happening. We aren't getting thunderstorms or anything like we said earlier.
No.
Europa has a very tenuous atmosphere. So what's actually happening is these. I know some people say geyser-like sort of eruptions of water are coming out of the actual surface of Europa.
Right.
And so can we use data to look at the timing of the eruption?
Right. Now, and we can do models, for example, to look at how long it would take to heat up that much of the crust. The area that we see. If it's something that's penetrating the entire crust, which at Europa is 25 plus or minus something kilometers
meaning
thick.
coming from
if it's
directly
coming
from the ocean and going all the way up.
Outside of Europa, it's not going to be as ephemeral as as storms or something like that, because it takes a long time to break through the crust.
So if it's not coming from the ocean, what is the alternative? Where else could it be?
Yes, that's a good question. There could be diapirs, or areas in the crust where warm water has risen up in the crust and is closer to the surface. And there are some areas, we call it chaos terrain, that are just, they're just spectacular on,
cool
on
name.
Europa. Yeah. And if you look at them, you can see they're plates of Europa, the shell, and you can see how they've moved around on top of this region. And so that suggests that there has been mobile material, possibly liquid water at depth, that they've been able to move around on, like icebergs, in the in the sea here. On
So before we go to the next question, if I could, so I think one of the things I had trouble wrapping my mind around was cryovolcanism versus the volcanism that we're very familiar with. So so you have the ocean down there, and then maybe some kind of isolated spots of warmer water closer, maybe. Is there an analogy you could use for where magma is on Earth? Is it like a hot spot versus a magma chamber under a volcano? I mean, I don't know. This might not be the right crowd to ask.
So one of the
but is that I'm trying to imagine? Yeah.
One of the complications is that we don't know what's under the ocean, right? And we don't know if the interior of Europa, for example, looks like Io, which has large silicate volcanoes. And so if there is volcanism under the ocean, the same way we have sub-ocean volcanism on Earth, then that could be one of the reasons that you get regions of heating. But that's something
we have no idea.
But that would be really exciting.
So are you able, a question for Shinja here, are you able to, I guess, how well can you localize where these plumes are coming out? To what kind of size scale do you think where the plume openings are, or how many plumes, and how can you, are you able to characterize them in that way?
Yes, that's something definitely we had spent some time looking at in doing this study. So when we first saw the data, the magnetic field data and plasma wave measurements, and we spotted out this 3-minute long signal that seems to be very unusual compared to all the other flyby data we have looked at near Europa. And again, based on the knowledge we learned from studying Enceladus, we know, when you have a plume in outer space, they're able to influence the magnetic field. They're able to influence the plasma environment. So that's kind of the information, the background knowledge we already had from studying Enceladus, and that guided us through our analysis. But to really make sense of the data, to really interpret the data, we had to go for numerical modeling. And it's exactly during the numerical modeling we had to test different plume models in terms of location, in terms of its size, in terms of its density, column density, for example. And I think luckily, Hubble images are very, very valuable in that sense, because you can see from those images how big roughly the plumes are. And they also tell us, they infer column densities for the potentially detected plumes. So we use those as constraints in our numerical computer model. And we tested a large number of plume models with the same kind of characteristics we saw in the Hubble images. And the one we found out, this one seems to have a very good match to the observations for the magnetic signal and plasma wave emissions.
Very cool.
So Galileo spent 3 minutes within the plume, or is it 3 minutes of data and the amount of time it spent within the plume is narrower than that?
The magnetic signal definitely shows a bend or a twist of the magnetic field about 3 minutes long.
Okay.
And so not only the magnetic field strength changes abruptly, it goes up and drops very quickly within that 3 minutes, but also its direction, because the magnetometer is able to tell us the direction of the magnetic field. And it also showed the very strength, the bending, the bend of the field lines.
Interesting.
And that's one of the things you see in the image we just put out. And the plasma wave emissions are able to tell us there seems to be localized more dense plasma in that around the same time when we see the magnetic signal.
Wow.
And how far, do you know how far Galileo moved in that 3 minute time span?
As Margaret mentioned, we know the speed of the spacecraft at the time is about 6 kilometers per second. So that 3 minute long interval corresponds to about 1,000 kilometers.
Wow, that's big.
Yeah.
Yeah.
at this altitude, at this about 200 to 400 kilometers high.
That's amazing.
Right, which means that it could be even broader, closer to the surface.
Yes, potentially, yes.
We have another question from the media here, and this is kind of following on to a question we were talking about a little bit earlier. The question is from Mark Carreau, Aviation Week, and Eric Niller from Wired. Have similar questions. Will Clipper have a means of detecting biomarkers, and how might the instruments compare to the ones on Cassini? So we've already talked a little bit about the ability to detect biomarkers, but it's a good question about how the instruments are similar or different from what flew on Cassini, because Cassini did fly through the plumes on Enceladus and made some observations there as well. So it'd be interesting. Can we?
Like Cassini, Europa Clipper has a suite of instruments that are designed to work together to understand, in this case, Europa as a system. And some of those instruments are remote sensing instruments like cameras, spectrometers that measure things from afar. And then others are instruments that measure things in situ or in place, right in the environment of the spacecraft, like a magnetometer or the plasma instrument or the mass spectrometer, for example. One of the big differences is that Clipper has a sounding radar. So that allows us to get information about the subsurface structure of Europa.
Yeah, so can you talk about that just a little bit more? So Cassini carried a radar that could see the surface, but a sounding radar can actually measure and see what's going on beneath the surface. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
So it's designed to be able to, it sends out signals and is sensitive to, at wavelengths that will penetrate into the ice. And then it is sensitive to detect how those signals return and where they reflect in the crust will give us information. For example, if there is liquid water that's perched up closer to the surface than the ocean, that would be something one would hope to be able to detect with a sounding radar.
So is it that, this beam, is it light, or it's actually
it's a longer wavelength.
Oh, okay. So this beam of something goes down, and does it move, or I guess does it travel at different speeds, whether it's solid ice or liquid? I mean, how do you tell the difference between the different structures?
Right. So the simplest thing to think about is that you'll send a signal and there'll be a reflection off the surface.
Okay.
Right, and so that's very easy to think about, because it reflects off the surface and you receive it, which gives you a measurement of the altimetry, of the topography of the surface.
Yes.
But then you're exactly right. There will be waves that penetrate into the surface, and you can detect when they come back, which tells how far they penetrated, how they were reflected,
and how they reflected back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Exactly.
Awesome. Oh, I'm so excited.
Really great.
And so, but we don't have that necessarily for Enceladus. Is that
correct?
Okay.
Correct. We didn't. Cassini had a different type of radar, as you said, that was designed to do synthetic aperture radar imaging. So that does surface imaging, but doesn't do deep sounding. It would only penetrate, tens of centimeters. Well, actually, to be fair, it actually penetrated into,
little bit.
hundreds of meters into the methane seas on Titan. But what the radar on Clipper is designed to do is penetrate kilometers into the ice shell, so that we can understand the structure of the ice shell. Yeah,
that's
really cool.
So cool.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh man.
That's great.
Chills again. Wow.
That's great. That's great. We've got another question from social media, and I think this is a great philosophical question for us to consider here. Facebook user Steve asks, could there be non-carbon-based life with completely different requirements for existence?
Oh my God.
And this is always a great question, because the only life we know is the life we know, which is ours. And so we think we understand what we're made of and what it takes for us to live. But, but what other ideas are out there? Could there be, how do we know what we don't know that we're looking for? So,
exactly.
That's a great
quite
question.
a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if anyone wants to, speculate, I guess. I don't think I know enough to,
For water-based life, the water is a solvent. That enables the materials to combine. And there are other solvents, and so it's quite possible to think that there might be life based on the other solvents as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, in the lakes of Titan, methane and ethane and
Right.
lots of other things, you know, those aren't water. So if there's life there, then it would be
Right.
based
It's
on a
possible
completely
that there
different-
might be places
Different,
where there are methane-based life forms. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Woo.
Sure. But that's
Exciting.
still carbon-based.
Oh,
It's,
that's
it's
true.
carbon-based,
That
but
is
it's not
carbon-based.
water-based.
But not water.
But not
based.
water-based.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so it wouldn't
Right.
require liquid
Gotcha.
water to
Yes.
exist.
Right. Right.
Oh, man.
That's the difference. Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Guys,
It is
what else
carbon-based. Right.
other than carbon
Yes.
could there
Yeah.
be? I mean,
It's hard
Yes.
to imagine.
yeah,
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Interesting question.
I have no
though.
idea how to address that.
Good question. We have another question from the media. This is from Bart Leahy, a Spaceflight Insider. How close will Europa Clipper get to Europa, and how many passes will it make by the moon?
Cool.
The nominal mission design that we have right now has over 40. Right now we have 44 close flybys
Cool.
of Europa, and many of those get down below 100 kilometers, and several are down at the 25-kilometer altitude, just screaming over the surface. Yeah,
Which is
it's
about
exciting.
15 miles. I looked
Yeah.
it up. That is mind-bogglingly
Yeah.
close. I mean, that is.
Yeah.
What is 15 miles away from DC? You know, I mean, just like, right? Do we have? Can we give a reference
It's
here?
less than DC to Annapolis, I think.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah, I commuted
That's like-
further this morning into.
yeah, like that's
Yeah, yeah.
scary close.
Yes.
I mean, that's so cool.
Yeah.
That is really amazing.
But that allows us to, you know, to look at the surface in very close
Yeah.
detail, and it makes it easier to measure the atmosphere because there'll be more material closer to Europa. If there are plumes, the further down into them, the better sensing of the
closer
material.
you get to the source
And that's
region, the better. yeah.
exactly, and that's also better for measuring the magnetic field too.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, if you get too far away from the plume proper, let's say there is indeed plume, then the signals will be contaminated with other effects. You know, the plasma is interacting with Europa constantly. So if you're too far away from the plume region, you may not have a chance to really tell a lot about the plume.
And what different aspects of the plume can you find out from getting that close? And would you be able to see, you know, material falling back onto the planet, you know, or excuse me, the moon?
Right.
Well, one of the challenges of Europa compared to, say, Enceladus is that Europa is much bigger. So there's a lot more gravity. So when you see these images of Enceladus with the plumes stretching
Yeah.
out almost as far above Enceladus as Enceladus is large, that's possible because there's so little gravity holding
Yeah,
material
yeah.
back. But on Europa, material won't be able to get as high, especially some of the particulate material. So being able to fly lower through the plume gets you closer to the source and therefore makes it possible, hopefully, to sample more of the material that's coming out.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I've got a question for Margaret. She's with us here. And so, Margaret, could you talk a little bit more about the magnetic field and the measurements that you took when you were at Europa? And Shunjan has talked a little bit about the magnetic signal that he saw in the plumes, but just kind of in general, what's the magnetic field like at Europa? And how many places in our solar system do we have a magnetic field?
Well, that's good. Let's start with how many places do we have magnetic fields? Not all of the planets have planetary magnetic fields. So Mars doesn't have a planetary magnetic field. Venus doesn't have a planetary magnetic field, but little Mercury does. So, and all of the giant planets. And as the Galileo made multiple orbits through the Jupiter system, we established how the field varies with space and time. And then we found each time we came close to one of the big moons, the field deviated from what had been present if the moon hadn't been there. And it's almost as if a boat is going through the water and that pushes the water to the side and makes waves on the side. So as the material of Jupiter's environment encounters one of these moons, it gets diverted, it gets slowed, and the magnetic field changes magnitude and bends, and we can relate all of those changes to properties of the moons.
Wow, that is amazing.
Yeah. And so how does the plume interact? Is it interacting with the magnetic field? I mean, how are we using the magnetic field to actually, and the plasma environment to find the plume?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good question, because the material that is coming out from Europa is probably electrically neutral. It's probably dominated by water vapor, which is a neutral material. But there are lots of energetic particles in the environment of Europa, and they ionize the material that is coming off. So they make it an electrically charged material, which can carry currents. And it's those electrically charged parts of the plume that cause the changes in the magnetic field that Shinja modeled so well, and change the density of the electrons in the environment that were measured by the plasma wave instrument. So it's not a direct effect on the environment from the plume. It's a two-step process.
Okay.
Wow. Thank you so much, Margaret.
Yeah,
That's
thank
great.
you.
We've got another question from social media. This is a Twitter user, Deepak asks, what's the temperature on Europa, and can bacteria survive at those temperatures? And we haven't really quite got this question from that angle yet.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we know about the bacteria, and could they actually survive at the temperatures that we think
Right.
Europa?
Well, the surface temperature is quite cold.
Right.
Just a little bit. Just a little
Well, how
chilly.
cold
Now,
is quite
yeah.
cold? How cold is quite cold?
I don't remember this.
I can. I mean,
Yeah,
I
I
can
don't
just
remember
look that
that
up
either.
right
Top of
here.
the
Let's
equator is
see.
about
Cold
100.
is,
It's about 100.
100
Thank you.
Kelvin.
100
about 100
Kelvin, which is minus 173 in Celsius, and you're going to have to figure out what that is in Fahrenheit for me.
Right.
Let's see.
but that's pretty darn cold. But how
It
cold
is.
we've talked about it being warmer in the water. Clearly,
Exactly.
it's a liquid water,
Yes.
and in part it could be colder than the freezing temperature of water, because it could have salts and other
Right.
types of chemicals in the water. So it could be a little
Right.
colder than water,
But we know there are bacteria on Earth that can survive in very extreme temperatures.
Sure. Yeah.
And certainly liquid water in the interior of Europa would probably be quite toasty for some of those.
Okay,
For some of those
okay.
bacteria. Whether there are levels in the in the ice where things can survive.
right.
That's
a good question too.
exciting question
Right,
to study.
right.
Well, we do know of one extremely cold place that life
Yes.
can survive, right? Lake Vostok.
Lake Vostok, yeah.
Right, in Antarctica, correct?
Right,
Yeah.
beneath the ice shell.
Yeah,
in
so do we,
Antarctica.
let's see, just, my quick internet searching here, it's about minus, 80, 90 degrees Celsius. So,
Okay.
we know there's some extremophile cold bacteria in there, or some
Okay.
maybe not bacteria, some microbes
Right.
down there. So I guess that's a start, right?
Good. All right, we've got another question. Great questions. Twitter user Jason Major is asking, what sort of effect might Europa's plume activity have on other nearby moons' surfaces? So that's a great question. So Shinja, you've looked at these plumes, at how high they are and a sense of how big they are. Is there a sense or a way for that material to
Yeah,
stay
that's a-
and perhaps be transported to another moon?
That's a
in
really
Jupiter's
excellent
system?
question. I think there Europa has also in the past been found to be a source of neutral particles, around the orbit of the moon, and it has always been a puzzling piece of information, observation we had, how to interpret the existence, seemingly a neutral cloud around Europa. I mean, we have long been thinking of Io as the major source of plasma to the Jovian environment,
Because
but
it's just spewing stuff
spewing
out.
volcano-
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
volcanoes, volcanic material into space. But Europa also seems to be important also in terms of providing neutral material. So we have to understand, the link between maybe whether or not plumes are are responsible for those type of phenomena we saw in the past.
Okay.
It's a great question. Yeah, I think it needs to be.
Good.
And we
good.
certainly see that in the Saturnian system.
Sure.
Enceladus is the source of the
Sure.
the E-ring, but yes,
Right.
also Io in the
And
Jovian
Io in the
Yeah.
system.
Jovian
So
case,
there's certainly a lot of exchange of material
Sure.
between
Sure.
satellites at times.
So I have another question for Margaret. And this question, Margaret, is back when you were working on designing and developing the magnetometer for Galileo, and then the mission flew and it was flying around Jupiter and visiting Europa. Did you ever anticipate these types of discoveries would be made with the Galileo data?
You know, it's amazing how hard it is to anticipate something that just hasn't happened before. Even discovering that Ganymede had a planetary magnetic field, one of the biggest moon of Jupiter had a magnetic field, that was really quite a surprise. Discovering that we had signatures that seemed to require a sub-ice ocean at Europa. Again, it had been discussed as a possibility, so we were aware of the possibility, but it was certainly not of something that we thought was highly probable. And then when we saw that there really was a signature of an ocean, it was quite an aha moment. So no, I don't think I would have anticipated this, and certainly not anticipated that we'd be finding out about plumes 20 years after we acquired the data.
That's amazing. That's just incredible to be involved in those types of incredible discoveries. Thank you so much, Margaret. We've got, I think, a few more minutes left for some of our discussion, and then we've got a video to kind of close out our hour here.
Yeah.
So maybe a few other topics.
Well,
for one thing, I want to ask what people want, what you would like the people that are listening and watching, what you'd like them to take away from this discussion and what we've learned from these. So go ahead, Shinja.
Yeah. So the one thing I feel extremely excited about was, having seen now this result from our paper really strengthens the case that, when you look also at the Hubble images, combining the two, kind of two independent piece of evidence, that now really strengthens the case that Europa seems to have plumes, and that really, I think, provides a great opportunity for future exploration of Europa.
Okay. All right, and I've got a quick media question they want us to squeeze in here
yep,
before we
absolutely.
close out. So how important is it to send a probe back to Enceladus to get comparative data? And this is from Marcia Smith at Space Policy Online, and this is a great question.
So we're saying after Europa Clipper?
After Europa, yeah. I mean,
that's one of the exciting things in the outer solar system is the diversity of the types of objects we've seen. And we've today have only talked about the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Only a few of the moons.
Right, only a few of those, right.
And the diversity of objects and the questions we have about moons as we get further out in the solar system, about Ariel at Uranus and Triton at Neptune. There's a lot of territory out there, a lot of terra incognita that would be really exciting to explore.
There is,
including Enceladus.
Yeah, and it's more than just an exploration. A lot of what we do in planetary science is comparing different places to each other, things that are similar and things that are different. We take a lot of what we do. We look at how things work on Earth, and then we look at the other planets and make sure that we understand how things are working there. So this is a big part of our approach. So certainly getting to Enceladus would be fantastic.
Very powerful
to
technique
compare.
to do that comparison.
Yeah,
awesome.
that would be great. That would be great.
Yeah.
So again, let's go back to Zibby here and see if you have some takeaway things that you'd really like people to take away from this discussion, from this new discovery, why it's so important to you, and going forward.
Well, I think it really demonstrates how much we are leveraging future exploration and discoveries on past data sets, and how much richness there is if we go back to data sets with a new context, right? With the HST data suggesting there might be something there, going back and reanalyzing that shows us something something we hadn't seen in the data before, and something we didn't know, and it you know, and taking that in the context of Cassini, it just shows the steps we're taking moving forward. But it also just really whets our appetite for what we're going to be doing at Europa.
We're so ready.
So ready.
Exactly.
And I mean,
So
if we're
ready.
finding this stuff now, what, 20 years later, I mean, what else could we
Right?
find? I mean, how much
Yeah.
more data is there to, you know, sort of mine through,
Yeah.
right? Oh,
Yeah.
my God.
Yeah, so Shinja, what are you going to discover next?
We'll see. Yeah, a lot of things to be learned. I think in the old data set. Yes, definitely one thing I learned from this study.
Yeah,
Yeah.
A lot of surprises.
a lot of
Yep.
surprises that the old data are still incredibly useful,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
The new data are great, but the old data are also, they hold a lot of
Yeah.
secrets we haven't yet uncovered.
Yeah.
So,
Yes,
so thank you so much for your work.
you're welcome.
Okay, I want to thank our audience, the listening audience. I want to thank the social media and all of the media for participating and sending in questions. There were some great questions. We really
Great
enjoyed sitting
questions,
here and
yeah.
talking about them.
We could
And-
talk for another hour.
could
I could
talk-
talk about this
Yes.
forever.
Very, very fascinating. The result is absolutely incredible to be able to say we really are confident there are plumes on Europa and have a mission that's really already in development,
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
and ready to make those measurements is fantastic.
Yep.
So to close this out, we're going to leave it with another video with our Associate Administrator for Science at NASA. It'll be Thomas Serbukin.
Today's announcement of yet more evidence of plumes jetting out of Europa marks an outstanding leap forward in our search for life and habitable environments in the solar system. There were hints of plumes in the past from the Hubble Space Telescope, but today's finding, which was mined from over decade-old data, gives us further evidence to sink our scientific teeth into. The fact that Galileo flew right through a plume tells us that on Europa, these plumes are common and calling us to explore. Europa has long been a high priority for exploration because it holds a salty liquid water ocean beneath its icy crust. In just a few years, the Europa Clipper spacecraft will be sailing towards that ocean world, equipped with the instruments necessary to investigate both the origins and the plumes and what ingredients they contain. Europa Clipper's ultimate aim is to determine whether Europa is habitable, possessing the ingredients we believe are necessary for life as we know it: liquid water, chemical ingredients, and an energy source. Europa's ocean is one of the most promising places that could potentially harbor life in the solar system. These newly confirmed plumes will provide another way to sample this vast ocean. Are we getting closer to answering, are we alone in the universe? The simple answer is yes. Perhaps that answer might come from a small ocean world like Europa. Thanks for watching.